ধাই যেন মোর সকল ভালো বাসা প্রভু তোমার পানে, তোমার পানে, তোমার পানে। যাই যেন মোর সকল গভীর আশা প্রভু তোমার কানে, তোমার কানে, তোমার কানে। ধাই যেন মোর সকল ভালো বাসা প্রভু তোমার পানে, তোমার পানে, তোমার পানে। চিত্ত মম যখন যেথা থাকে, সারা যেন দেয় সে তবু ডাকে। চিত্ত মম যখন যেথা থাকে, সারা যেন দেয় সে তবু ডাকে। যত বাঁধন সব টুটে গো যেন প্রভু তোমার টানে, তোমার টানে, তোমার টানে। ধাই যেন মোর বাহিরে ভিক্ষা ভরা থানে, এবার যেন নিঃশেষে হয় খালি। অন্তর গোপনে যাই ভরে প্রভু তোমার দানে, তোমার দানে, তোমার দানে। হে বন্ধু মোর, হে অন্তর তার, এ জীবনে যা কিছু সুন্দর, হে বন্ধু মোর, হে অন্তর তার, এ জীবনে তোমার গানে, তোমার গানে, তোমার গানে ধাই যেন মোর সকল ভালো বাসা প্রভু তোমার পানে, তোমার পানে, তোমার পানে।
Good morning, everyone. Today's retreat topic is managing the mind, and it is based on the Raja Yoga Sutras, the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And so let us begin with a guided meditation, an ancient Sankhya Yoga guided meditation that Vivekananda used to deliver in his Raja Yoga classes. So let us sit still and straight, chest slightly forward, feet firmly planted on the ground. So if we're a little short, we can move forward in our chair so that our feet are grounded. And place your hands in your lap as Vivekananda has his, right palm upturned on the left upturned palm, and just resting loosely, relaxed to hold the meditation. Close our eyes and begin 3 times, breathing in deeply and exhaling completely. Picture the mind as a calm lake stretched before you. Let the mind drift. See how thoughts come and go as bubbles rising and breaking on the surface, becoming ripples that are ever widening circles. Make no effort to control your thoughts, but watch them. Follow them in imagination as they rise, break, and float away. I am not the mind. I see that I am thinking. I am watching my mind act. Hold fast to the idea, I am the witness, watching my mind drift. The mind is not I. Watch the mind as a thing entirely apart from yourself. Identify yourself with God, neither with mind or matter. Be the witness. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this is a mindfulness meditation that is the pratyahara, withdrawing the mind. And our teachers tell us when we sit to meditate, don't try to grab your mind and pull it in, but watch it. And disidentify with your mind, because anything that you can observe is matter. Science tells us that. And so these thoughts, these bubbles, these emotions, these visuals that come to the mind, it's matter, subtle matter. And in that way, we pull back from the mind with a higher mind called the buddhi. And what is the buddhi? The buddhi is that portion of the mind that is in the heart. It is where spiritual experiences take place, but it is also pointing to the unseen seer. So to develop that higher mind is very key and essential in Raja Yoga, in managing the mind, which is our subject today. Nobody really knows the exact date of the Yoga Sutras, somewhere between the 2nd and the 3rd century CE. But it's a manual for the human mind. And it is systematic, comprehensive manual on the science and art of meditation. It reflects the view of the Sankhya school, but is concerned primarily with what works. And it's presented in a universal matter. It tells us what the mind is, how it works, how to make it work for us to reach enlightenment. And sutra is literally a thread. It's a condensed statement. And there are 195 sutras in the Yoga Sutras. And these sutras are meant as an outline for the teacher. And they expand to reveal the depth and breadth of the meaning. There are many commentators. Vyasa was from the Sankhya school, Vachaspati Misra from the Advaita Vedanta school, and we have many others, including Swami Vivekananda himself. Let us begin with Yoga Sutra 1. Atta Yoganushasanam. Hereafter, now yoga is being discussed, is the translation. Anushasanam means further teaching, implies an already existing body of knowledge. Patanjali was indebted to the traditions that preceded him. The yoga practice was 4,500 years ago in the Indus Valley. We find there carved images of the male figure Shiva, seated in meditation on the yoga posture. And the Rig Veda describes a long-haired, naked devotee of Shiva that resembles the yogins today. The Upanishads, the Katha and the Svetasvatara, written in 500 BCE, talk about the yogic practices. The Bhagavad Gita also talks about yogic disciplines. The tantric scripture, the Pashupata Sutra, describes the yoga of 8 limbs. So meditation and yoga were widely practiced in ancient India and used by the ancestors of today's Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, before sectarian boundaries became firmly drawn. So a student must be well acquainted to study, well qualified to study yoga. Sutra 2, Yogas Chittavritti Nirodha. Yoga is the control of the vrittis, which are the urges, the modifications or tendencies, loosely translated as thought waves, that arise out of the chitta, the mind stuff. yoga is a procedure to stop these whirlpools of the mind. Just as we were trying to calm the mind, we saw that we're not thinking clear thoughts when we're just thinking. It's scattered thoughts, whirlpools, memories, images, emotions. All of these comprise the whirlpools of the mind. So yoga is a method, and it's also a goal. And yoga is a state of enlightenment and freedom once the mind is stilled. And what is the mind? The mind is a person's own field of awareness through which he or she experiences life in this world. The mind receives, sorts, and processes information coming through the senses, the ears, the skin, the eyes, the nose, the tongue, and compares, reasons, and reaches conclusions. It personalizes the experience. It is I who experience. We all have that sense that it is I who experience. So whatever is present in the mind becomes mine. My experience, my notion, my opinion, my choice, my memory. So the goal is getting to the state where all this mental activity stops, going beyond everyday states of mind. And this takes practice, this takes years to develop that steadiness and stability of mind. Now, Vyasa, one commentator, who is not Patanjali, noted that the mind has 5 levels of activity. Sometimes it's excited and unable to focus. That's kshipta. Sometimes it's dull. We think, I can hardly think. The mind feels like mud. That's mura. Sometimes it's normal. And what does normal look like? Sometimes it's concentrated, sometimes distracted. Vikshipta. Then, as we advance in yoga, it becomes one-pointed, focusing on one thing only, ekagra. So the way to still the restless mind is guiding the principle throughout the phases of yoga. Potentially shows concentration can be deepened and prolonged to the final goal. It takes practice. So we want to complete the cessation of all mental activity that is called niruddha. What is the definition of yoga? In Advaita Vedanta, yoga is the union or merging of the individual conscious self, the Atman, with the infinite self, the transcendental Brahman. In the dualistic Samkhya school, it recognizes 2 eternally separate realities. Consciousness, the Purusha, which we sometimes equate with the Atman, and materiality, which is Prakriti, which we in Vedanta quote with material, which the mind is part of, this body-mind complex and the external world that we see. Yoga is the union of the individual's awareness with its own true nature as consciousness, and that is where Vedanta would agree. But reaching that state, one commentator says, involves disunion or disengagement of essential conscious being, the Purusha, from the defining and binding characteristics of material nature, which is Prakriti, with which it has seemingly become entangled and consequently formed a mistaken sense of identity, which we do all the time. For example, this is a classic example of what happens and how it happens. Even during the time of Patanjali, there was glass. So the example is given of a quartz crystal made from glass. The glass has no color. It's clear crystal. But when a red flower comes close to the glass, it turns red. If it's a yellow hibiscus, it turns yellow. The glass seems to be sometimes red and sometimes yellow, like a chameleon. But what is the true color of the crystal? It remains clear all the time. So also, we are self-forgetful of our true nature, which was always and is always clear crystal. Every time we identify with the body, with the mind, with the moods of the mind, with ideas, people around us, what they say about us, we forget who we are. When we don't pay attention or show interest to these distractions or attachments that veil our true nature, we remember we are the clear crystal. And this happens all the time. We say, this is mine, this body is mine, this mind is mine, this house is mine, these children are mine. You see? My friends, my family, my job, my this, my that. All of these thought processes bind us. They make us appear as the red, to ourselves, as the red crystal or the yellow crystal. So a discerning observer understands that a trick is played by the color behind the glass, and that is our urges, our modifications, our tendencies that arise in the mind. The crystal is the pure self, not discolored, but allows color to pass through it because of its transparency, without changing its nature. It appears to have changed its color according to the color I see behind the glass, but in reality, the color is appearance. The reality is pure, clear crystal. Purusha means that which resides within you, ever conscious. Whatever passes before it, it illuminates that. The knower of the self doesn't discern or identify with modifications of the mind, these vrittis that take us to far distant places. But the beginning of an aspirant's mind takes shape, the shape of the thought waves, really. And you can practice this in your mindfulness meditation. You see how these thought waves become large. They expand in our mind and we identify with them. And they're ripples. I really am only there to illuminate thought, experience it, but in the process, I become blended with it. I have blended myself with the thought. I'm hurt and angry. I'm sad. Instead, I am free. I am pure consciousness. You know, Swami Sarvapriyananda tells a wonderful story of a businessman who went to a Swami and said, I'm miserable. And the Swami said, oh no, you're not miserable. You know, who was watching the misery in your mind? You are separate from the misery. The seer cannot be the seen. You yourselves have witnessed in the beginning opening meditation, you were watching your thought waves. You are not the thought. You are the seer of the thought. Then the businessman said, oh, I'm so happy. And the Swami said, no, you're not happy. You feel happiness, but you are the witness of the happiness. So we must re-educate ourselves to detach from the colors and think instead, I am the clear crystal. And this practice becomes easier the more we understand the process of our ignorance. Yoga Sutra 3. Tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. At that time, the seer, experiencer, rests in his or her own state when the vrittis have been stopped, silenced. So yoga here is the ultimate condition, not the process. It is samadhi. Devadatta Kali, who's a Vedantin and a scholar, explained when all the distracting and overshadowing activity of the mind ceases, then only consciousness itself remains. It can be experienced, but never described. The self is free from any condition. It's beyond anything that can affect or define it in any way. Now we come to Yoga Sutra 4. Vritti sarupyam itarata. At other times, other than that of the true state, when the mind is not resolved, silenced, purified, the seer is identified with the modifications of the mind. So we find there are two ways to experience consciousness. This unchanging, self-luminous self, or as a finite individual caught up in the dynamic of the world of I and other, I and other. So these 4 slokas are the pillar of yoga. We must try to understand what is happening within ourselves. Why don't we understand why I am a victim of circumstances? And we all feel this. Why don't we help ourselves? Use positive vrittis within ourselves. So we must strive to change our life by refashioning ourselves into a perfected instrument in the hands of God, our chosen ideal. Sutra 5. Vrittaya panchataya klishta klishta. Patanjali tells us there are 5 classifications of modulations. Some are painful and some are not. Patanjali recognizes suffering. It's inherent in life. We have suffered, therefore we have come here. See? It's all part of our progression in life. The Samkhya school presents a scientific way to transcend suffering, the suffering of our human condition. What are the 5 kinds of mental activity? Sutra 6. Pramana viparyaya vikalpa nidra smritaya. Right knowledge, misapprehension, verbal delusion, sleep, and memory. These are the 5 states. Everything is experienced through the mind. Again, Devadatta Kali. Whatever happens around us, whatever thoughts and feelings arise within, whatever we dream for the future or recollect from the past, all that is a result of the mind's activity, which falls into 5 basic categories. Right knowledge. What if right knowledge brings pain, we might ask? Then there's wrong knowledge. What if someone tells a white lie to protect us? Verbal delusion. The mind creates daydreams and anxiety. That's verbal delusion. Then there's sleep. And then there are memories that bring joy, regret, hurt. Those are samskaras. Sutra 7. Pratyaksha anumana agama pramanani. Swami Vivekananda's translation. Direct perception, inference, and competent evidence are called proof of right knowledge. Those are our avenues that we can use. And right knowledge rests on 3 means of knowing. 5 channels of perception, stream into the mind which tries to make sense of it. This is happening to all of us. For example, a child touches an apple, feels its roundness, its stem, bites into it, feels the crunchiness and the sweetness of the apple. See? That's direct experience. Inference means where there is smoke, I understand there is fire. So we all practice this inference to a greater or lesser extent. Then there's scriptural authority. When perception and inference are not available, like right now in our spiritual life, scriptural authority takes place and is very helpful. If something happens in India, I don't witness it, but learn maybe from the Wall Street Journal, a reliable source, and trust it as true. That's my personal reliable authority. But Sri Ramakrishna joked, if it's written in the newspaper, it must be true. And therefore one's disbelief, if not written in the newspaper. He gave a beautifully funny example. Captain said about Bunking. Captain was a devout officer, and Bunking a rather worldly novelist. Captain said, I see, he believes that lust and so forth are necessary, but he doesn't believe that Sri Krishna could enjoy his sportive pleasure in the world, that God could incarnate himself in a human form and sport in Vrindavan with Radha and the gopis. And the master said, smiling, but these things are not written in the newspaper. How could he believe them? And then he gave the example. A man said to his friend, yesterday as I was passing through a certain part of the city, I saw a house fall with a crash. Wait, said the friend, let me look it up in the newspaper. But this incident wasn't mentioned in the paper. Thereupon the man said, but the paper doesn't mention it. His friend replied, I saw it with my own eyes, direct perception. Be that as it may, said the man, I can't believe it as long as it isn't in the newspaper. Sutra 8. Viparyayo mithya jnanam atad rupa pratishtam. Swami Vivekananda's translation. Indiscrimination is false knowledge, not based on the real nature of an object. Okay, so occasionally the mind misinterprets information received through the senses. When I was in Coimbatore several years back, the Swami, the head of the center, and I were walking through the center. It's a huge center complex at dusk. And suddenly we saw what was a snake. And at night, the example is often given that we can mistake a rope for a snake. But that's a mistake in thinking. We kid ourselves, we self-deceive, we're in denial. We disconnect between what actually is and how we understand it to be. Such thinking is at odds with the reality of the relative world. So in fact, the Swami approached this snake that could have been a rope, but it was in fact a snake. So from the standpoint of the supreme reality, Brahman, this world is an illusion. We may mistake the world for reality, for the reality as we see it, flesh and bones, materiality. So we are living a false knowledge now. But Shankara and Sri Ramakrishna, they both say, so long as the world is experienced, it is real, but relatively real. And therefore, Sri Ramakrishna taught Holy Mother, behave according to time, place, and circumstance. Practical Vedanta. And we must move in the relative world with discrimination and mindfulness. This applies to all, even the unillumined. Sutra 9. Shabda Jnana Nupati Vastu Shunyo Vakalpaha. Verbal delusion follows from words having no corresponding reality. Verbal delusion are words spoken. They create vrittis in the mind, and they take the shape in the form of the ideation, of the idea. We enjoy it, are agitated by it, fear can arise from it, even though it has no corresponding reality in the relative world. It's like going to a movie, a murder mystery. Somebody is murdered and we jump out of our seat. Oh no, we have identified with a false reality. Even when an object is not physically present, we can still think about it, which can evoke a strong reaction within us. This is conceptualization. It's also imagination. Even when an object or event is unreal, as this world is unreal, we can still obsess about it. But Swami Vivekananda tells us, death, coming and going, is all pure delusion. The Atman never comes or goes. This is in our memorial service that we give for the departed, this beautiful teaching. Yes, when we lose someone, there is no coming or going. So an example of verbal delusion is a son of a barren woman. This is classic example. But it can also mean vague notions. Swami Ashokananda, the former head of the Vedanta Society of Northern California, he was an Advaitin. He said, one thing, it's to be unconvinced about Vedanta concepts. That's okay. But it's another to have vague notions about those concepts. So we can question, but you can't just sit on your haunches and always question. You must search for the truth. If we want the truth, we must search for it. But we must also go to a qualified teacher with our questions. That's one of the wonderful things I learned about Vedanta. We don't just get to question. We must question. That shows the level of our understanding of Vedanta, where we're coming from. Sutra 10. Abhava pratyaya lambana vrittir nidra. Sleep is a vritti which embraces the feeling of voidness. When we sleep, the mind disengages from the body and the world, but the power of ideation continues in creating dreams. This happens to all of us. Devadatta Kali. In a dream, just as when you are awake, you are the central character of your world. But now the world is one of your own making and exists only in your own mind. The dream may be realistic or fantastic. Someone who sees you sleeping has no idea of your dream. Sometimes the effect of the dream will persist even after you wake up. Then there's dreamless sleep. Even then, the mind retains some measure of activity. You wake up and say, I slept well. I know nothing. First of all, in that statement, we understand that the dreamer had a sense of self. A sense of self was present. And it did something. It knew. And lastly, that mental activity had an object. Nothing. A beautiful example of this is there's a dark night and you're in a car and you're going up a mountain and you have the headlights on. And you come to the top of the mountain and your headlights are out in space. That is deep sleep. The light is the consciousness of the self, but it is seeing nothing. It is knowing nothing. Devadatta. The mind was aware of all three, but because mental activity never ceased, you were not aware of your own true being, a self-luminous, self-aware consciousness. Thus, for an ordinary person, deep sleep is not yoga. We can't live without deep sleep. We wake up and feel refreshed, and we're able to move on through the day. But sleep for the rishi is different. Swami Pravrajika used to tell us, an illumined soul sleeps in a different way. We wake up and say, I am so-and-so. Swami Swahananda said, an illumined soul wakes up and says, I am Brahman. From our own experience in the Santa Barbara convent, we knew Swami Brahmananda often appeared to Swami Pravrajika in dream and would instruct him at that time. In the 1940s and 50s, Swami Pravrajika used to go to a devotee's estate in Europe to vacation and relax. In Santa Barbara, one of our oldest German devotees who escaped Nazi Germany, Umbika, reminisced about how she, in the 1940s, late 1940s, or early 50s, learned he was there and wrote to him asking for initiation. She took a bus and made her way to this place. I believe it was in Switzerland. Swami told her to come there, and he gave her initiation in the privacy of his host's beautiful, expansive garden. And in those days, initiations were more informal. Later that day, Swami's host, Franz de Specker, who later became a trustee of the Vedanta Society of Southern California, gave Umbika a tour of his mansion. And as they walked by Swami's empty guest room, Franz opened his door, and Umbika saw two chairs that were facing each other just inside the room. And Franz simply explained, Swami Brahmananda came to Swami Pravrajika last night, and so Swami put out a chair for him to sit on, and they talked through the night. Swami Hiranmoyananda related a beautiful story about Swami Vijnanananda at Bellarmont. One morning, he went to pay his respects and asked Maharaj, how did you sleep? Do you know how I sleep? Swami Vijnanananda replied. I quiet the mind and then withdraw my prana into the heart and then focus on the infinity of the Atman and dissolve into that. Oh, Swami Hiranmoyananda said, Maharaj, we don't have to go to so much trouble. Swami Turiyananda practiced entering deep sleep knowingly, a form of samadhi. The dreamless state is the awareness of our primordial ignorance. And when and if we can remain conscious between waking and sleep states, ignorance is destroyed. But Turiyananda Swami, by practicing this, lost the capacity to sleep. And so he had to stop the practice. Swami Virajananda, the sixth president of the Ramakrishna order, also had that capacity. Swami Sridharananda explained to me one day, I would be with Swami Virajananda from 6 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. every day. I would position him on his side for sleep at 10 p.m. and immediately there would not be a flicker. It was my feeling, not because he was my guru, that he was immersed in Niruddha Yoga. He asked that no one disturb him when he was sleeping. So to awaken, we would take a handkerchief and gently touch the sole of his feet. The toe would move and he would gradually awaken. Sutra 11. Anubhuta Vishayam Pramosha Smritihi. Memory is when vrittis of perceived subjects do not slip away and through impressions come back to consciousness. So whatever the experience we have, we experience it through the mind. Though fleeting, it leaves a lasting impression, conscious, subconscious, unconscious. So it's important to note that all impressions are consciously taken in the mind and then become subconscious and unconscious, whether it be right knowledge, misapprehension, verbal delusion, or sleep. Each one is a sum total, each one of us is a sum total of past experiences, mental and physical. We're conditioned by experiences. Conditioning and experiences, mental and physical, form our character. External experiences themselves don't form our character, but our reaction to them does. Our reaction to them does. How we handle them. Spirituality is attenuating the negative, nourishing the positive, bringing spiritual life to bear on both. There's a beautiful example of this. Swami Vivekananda met a Rishikesh monk with a luminous face. This is how we can change our samskaras. He was asked by this monk if he knew Pravrajika Baba. And we can read about this in the life of Swami Vivekananda by his Eastern and Western disciples. During Swami Vivekananda's wandering days, he journeyed to Varanasi, where he met a great sannyasi who lived in a cave in the high bank of the Ganga. Here he mastered the Advaita Vedanta system, after which he traveled for many years, studying and leading a life of great austerity. This was Pravrajika Baba. Finally, he came back to his old home, Ghazipur, where, emulating his teacher in Varanasi, he dug a hermitage in the ground on the riverside, and for many hours a day he remained in meditation, and the nights he spent on the other side of the river in ascetic and religious practices. His daily diet consisted of a handful of bitter neem leaves or of a few pods of red pepper. He held all work to be worshiping the Lord, and he would often give the food he had cooked after offering it to his chosen deity, to the poor, or to wandering monks, himself refusing to eat. So spare was his gratitude to the saint, and spoke of him as one of the greatest masters he had ever loved and served. This was Swami Vivekananda's devotion to Pravrajika Baba. So Swami Vivekananda told this monk who was standing before him, "Yes, I know Pravrajika Baba." And the monk then asked, "Have you heard of the thief who visited his ashram and stole his few belongings. How Babaji ran after the thief who dropped the stolen things. How Babaji ran after the fleeing robber with the fallen goods and caught up with the robber, saying, "All these are yours, Narayana." Swami Vivekananda said, "Yes, I know the story well. How wonderful was Pavhari Baba." The monk said, "Well, I was that thief. I saw my wickedness, repented, and adopted a life to gain the most priceless treasure. For the thief, it was such a powerful experience at that time. And then the memory of it worked on his consciousness and triggered holy impressions within him that gradually, completely transformed him." Swami Vivekananda spoke later in America about sinners who become saints. So how does memory work? A small child again picks up a fallen apple, does not know what it is. He's told that it is called an apple and good to eat. So this information enters the storehouse of the mind and resurfaces every time the child sees an apple on the ground. And this process works for perception, for other kinds of knowing, no matter how concrete or abstract. Devadatta Kali. All these stored impressions of things and people and events and words and ideas can bring back to our present awareness at a moment's notice. We all have that capacity. So an understanding of memory and how it works plays an important part in yogic practice. Swami Asheshananda told the story. Once Swami Turiyananda was in pain and about to undergo an operation. There was no anesthesia, so the doctor offered him alcohol, and the Swami shook his head, saying, "Samskara." Samskara is a process of the action, mental or physical, recurring in the mind ever after. It's a repetitive process that occurs within every one of us unless we use yoga to attenuate that samskara. But in this example, he's showing the power of samskaras that can happen years ago, not to speak of lifetimes ago, which explains, uncommon fear of heights or uncommon fears of this or that, phobias. All of these things can relate to samskaras from past lives. In this connection, it's interesting to note the neuroscience of memory and how addiction occurs. And Dan Siegel, MD, explains, memory can be defined as a way in which a past experience alters the probability of how the mind functions in the future. Memory shapes how we experience the present and how we anticipate the future, readying us in the present moment for what comes next based on what we've experienced in the past. It goes on. Experience creates the activation or firing of the neurons. This neuronal activation can in turn lead to alterations in the connections among the neurons. So it's a mental and physical process that takes place within us. Through experience, mental and physical, we encode and strengthen neural connections and thus embed our experience into memory. And this is why regularity in spiritual practice is so important. Just the memory of going to our shrine every day creates the habit, keeps us going. In Santa Barbara, some of the nuns and I were in the habit of chanting the complete Deva Mahatmyam once a week. And we would go to our little shrine there. If you've ever been to Santa Barbara, we have a little shrine in the heart of the convent where the work began. And then we had later a temple that was built in the 1950s. And of course, being in the country, we have watchdogs. And one of our nuns was in charge of our German Shepherd, Martha. So Martha would accompany us down to the shrine every morning at 4:30 or 5 a.m. And we would go through the process before the little shrine was open for other members of the convent. And then Martha would accompany her owner back to her bedroom. Well, one week we decided that we were going to change the day of the Chandi from Saturday to Tuesday. But on Saturday morning, Martha got up and walked alone to the little shrine and sat there for the full span of the hour and 15 minutes. And then after that time, she walked back to her room. So this is how we program ourselves to carry on our spiritual practice through thick and thin. There are 3 levels of practice. Gross, which is stilling perceptions. Subtle, stilling of ideas present in the inner realm of the mind. And causal, prevention of the subconscious actions from even rising. Patanjali's methodology, when routinely practiced, can actually stop distracting or disturbing vrittis before they even arise. There's a beautiful story of Swami Saradananda that I heard from Swami Sridharananda. It was about the Swami and a young man who became a monk and was blessed by the Swami. The young monk was trying his best to carry on his spiritual practices. Then one day, he went to Swami Saradananda and asked, "When any passion gets hold of me, it destroys me. Like if an urge of anger comes to me. Do passions happen to you?" he asked. Swami Saradananda said, "Yes, that is how passions occur." The monk then asked, "How do you manage, Maharaj?" And the Swami replied, "The difference between you and me lies here. I see sitting here deep within my psyche that a small speck of dust, like a dark cloud, is forming. Slowly and slowly it is growing in dimension, and from that depth it is coming to the surface. I see, I watch. It is growing in dimension and it is coming to the surface mind, and it wants to prod me, as it does to you. But I watch as an eternal witness, an observer. It comes and wants to prod me, but it passes over, and I remain as I am. So you also must develop this capacity." Sutra 12. Abhyasa vairagyabhyam tanirodha. These vrittis are controlled by practice and non-attachment. The big question is, do we let external circumstances, sensations, thoughts, opinions push us around and shut us down? Or do we remain calm? Patanjali mentions practice and dispassion in the same sutra. Why? Because they go together. They balance each other. We can row our boat, but if we don't lift our anchor, our boat stays in the same place. Practice requires will, diligent work. But if we're too caught up and identified with our endeavor, we become possessive and it takes hold of us. The endeavor takes hold of us. If we're too emotionally invested, we become a slave to the ups of so-called success and the downs of failure. So dispassion disallows attachment to events or circumstances to disturb our inner well-being or divert us from the goal. But dispassion is not indifference. Even advanced sadhakas struggle with the balance of these two traits. About practice, Holy Mother said, "One should shun laziness and practice japa and meditation regularly. Once in Dakshineshwar, I was unwell and did not get up at 3 o'clock. I felt lethargic. The next day, I got up even later. This happened on several successive days." This is Holy Mother speaking. "Gradually, I felt that I no longer have the inclination to get up early. At once, I realized that it was a trick of the mind and the laziness had possessed me. I then forced myself to get up at the usual time and resumed my previous habit. We cannot succeed in spiritual life without firm determination." Now, if Holy Mother can go through this, that makes us feel so much stronger that we can take her as an example and know that it is common, it is normal to feel and go through these ups and downs, but to take her example and exert our willpower. So we see how dispassion arises also in the telling example of the Pravrajika Brahmani, who was Sri Ramakrishna's teacher. She was a nun and Sri Ramakrishna's guru in various tantric disciplines that he undertook. But she became very possessive of Sri Ramakrishna and tried to prevent him from taking sannyas, fearing the master's love of God would disappear from his heart if he practiced non-dualism. She even tried to prevent Sri Ramakrishna from teaching and training his wife, Sarada Devi, jealous as she was of his closeness to her. Sri Ramakrishna ignored her advice, but her jealousy finally erupted in bitter arguments with Hridoy. But when the Brahmani calmed down, she realized and understood her mistake. One day she adorned Sri Ramakrishna with garlands of flowers and sandal paste and begged his forgiveness. She offered herself to God, then departed for Varanasi after living with Sri Ramakrishna for 6 years. Thus, by learning from great souls, their struggles give us insight into the obstacles in spiritual life, strength and support, knowing that they too struggled, and the courage to deepen our practice, holding on to the systematic teachings of the Yoga Sutras and the examples of the great souls in the Ramakrishna Vedanta tradition, who are themselves living scriptures. So this is the end of part 1. We've gone over time a little, so we won't be ending with a guided meditation for this section. So we can end now and have our break.